before the whispers, before the letters, before the silence stretched across 2 decades, there was only the promise of a life just beginning. It was the summer of 1985 in Bridge Hollow, Pennsylvania, and the air was thick with the sounds of cicadas and the soft creak of porch swings. The kind of summer where time felt slower, like the whole town was caught in a golden pause. Fireflies drifted lazily above open fields, and screen doors slammed behind barefoot kids long after the streetlights came on. And in the center of it all was Mark Holloway. Mark was 22, tall, quiet, thoughtful. The kind of young man who looked people in the eye when they spoke and always listened more than he talked. That spring, he had graduated from Allegheny College with a degree in environmental science. His backpack was still dusty from fieldwork. His notebooks filled with sketches of river systems and soil samples, and tucked in his drawer was an acceptance letter to an environmental internship in Oregon, a first step toward a life he had dreamed of since he was 15. His world was full of forward momentum, big plans, real promise. His mother, Janice, remembered the way his laughter echoed through the house on Sunday mornings. His father, Roger, still carries Mark's watch in the inside pocket of his coat. And his younger sister Laura, just 18 at the time, never forgot what he told her the night before he vanished. "You should come with me someday," he said, smiling. "The trees out west, they don't just move in the wind. They speak if you listen long enough." That night, Mark ruffled her hair like always, grabbed his keys, and walked out the door. He told his parents he was heading to visit a retired professor, Dr. Winslow, about an hour's drive away. He never made it there. The next morning, his bed was still made. By lunchtime, Janice was pacing the kitchen floor. By 2 p.m., Roger was on the phone with the police. 2 days later, they found Mark's truck a rust-colored 1974 Ford abandoned near Fall Creek Preserve. The driver's door was left open. The keys were still in the ignition. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no tire tracks leading away. Just the sound of the nearby creek and the hush of the woods that surrounded it. It didn't make sense. Mark hated that trail. He used to call it creepy, said something about the trees there felt wrong. It wasn't on the way to his professor's house. He hadn't been there in years. But that's where the truck sat, like a forgotten thought left behind in the forest. Search teams moved in quickly. State troopers, local volunteers, K-9 units, helicopters. They combed every inch of the preserve for nearly a week. They found nothing, not a scrap of clothing, not a single footprint, no clues, no leads. And just like that, Mark was gone. The case officially remained open, but over the months that followed, the urgency faded. The search parties shrank, the police calls slowed, people stopped asking, and the Holloways were left with the kind of silence that never really lifts. In a small town like Bridge Hollow, rumors come faster than answers. Some said he ran off to escape the pressure. Others suggested drugs, or that maybe he'd fallen in with the wrong people. A few whispered darker theories: suicide, abduction, foul play. But none of them could explain what Laura found in his room 2 weeks after he vanished. It was a torn piece of cereal box folded into quarters, wedged between the pages of his old hiking journal. Scrawled across it in pencil, barely legible: "They're watching the river. If anything happens, follow the trail to where the trees stop." Laura kept it. She didn't tell her parents. She didn't tell the police. She taped it inside her journal and carried it with her for the next 20 years. For the Holloways, life became something suspended, a calendar that never turned past July. Janice continued setting a place for Mark at Thanksgiving. Roger refused to sell the truck, parked it in the barn out back, where it gathered more dust with every passing year. And Laura, who had once idolized her big brother, changed the course of her life because of him. She moved to Pittsburgh, became a journalist, covered crime, corruption, environmental law, anything that brought her closer to the edge of hidden truth. And every year on the anniversary of Mark's disappearance, she returned home. She walked Fall Creek, took notes, asked old questions, knocked on doors. The answers never came. The case went cold. The trail went quiet. By the early 2000s, even the police had stopped returning her calls. Mark Holloway had become a name in a box, a file stored in the back of a drawer, a face on a faded flyer pinned to a forgotten bulletin board. But stories like his don't really end. They wait. They wait for someone to open the drawer again. They wait for a single spark. And in February of 2005, that spark arrived. An envelope. No return address. Postmarked from Missouri. Inside, a folded note. The paper was creased, yellowed slightly at the edges. One line was written across the center in familiar handwriting. The trail ends where the trees stop whispering, "I'm sorry I couldn't come back." It was signed with a single letter, M. The handwriting was shaky, but Laura recognized it instantly. It was her brother's, or at least it looked like it. Attached to the note was a small hand-drawn map, a trail through Fall Creek Preserve, and, marked near the bottom, an offshoot path, one not recorded on any official maps. And suddenly, after 20 years of silence, the story of Mark Holloway wasn't over. It was just beginning again. The last day anyone saw Mark Holloway alive began like any other. Warm sun, clear skies, coffee on the porch with his mother. He'd been quieter than usual, she recalled. Thoughtful, maybe distracted. He told her he was heading out to meet someone doctor. Winslow, the retired professor he'd worked with at Allegheny College. The plan, he said, was to talk about the internship in Oregon, maybe get a reference letter. He was wearing a gray canvas jacket, jeans, and his old hiking boots. His backpack was slung casually over one shoulder. He left just after 5 in the evening. The drive from Bridge Hollow to Winslow's cabin took a little over an hour. Mark never arrived. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills and the first porch lights flickered on, his mother was already uneasy. When 10 o'clock passed with no call, her worry turned to dread. By midnight, Roger was in the truck, driving the back roads near the highway, hoping for a flat tire. A wrong turn, something ordinary. What he found instead was nothing. No sign of Mark, no sign of the truck. At sunrise, they called the police. Within 24 hours, local deputies issued a missing person bulletin. By day 2, a park ranger spotted Mark's truck parked at the edge of Fall Creek Preserve, a place Mark had avoided for years. The keys were still in the ignition. The driver's door left ajar. A few pine needles scattered across the seat. No wallet, no backpack, no Mark. The area was known for its dense forest, old logging trails, and a network of shallow caves. Some hikers called it beautiful, others unforgiving. That week, it was suffocating. Search crews moved in immediately. Dozens of officers, trained dogs, volunteers from town. They scoured the woods for days. Helicopters circled overhead. Drones didn't exist then, so every foot of terrain had to be covered the hard way slowly and on foot. They searched for 8 days straight. They found nothing. No signs of a struggle. No blood. No boot prints beyond the ones by the truck. No dropped items. Not even a broken twig leading away from the trailhead. It was as if Mark had opened his door and stepped into the woods and then simply ceased to exist. Detective Ray Landers led the investigation. A seasoned officer with 17 years on the force, Landers was methodical, grounded. He wasn't the kind to chase ghost stories. But something about the case unsettled him. He later told reporters, "It was too clean, too quiet. I've seen runaways. I've seen kids try to disappear. This wasn't that. This was something else." At first, authorities leaned toward the theory that Mark had wandered off and gotten lost. Maybe an accident, maybe a fall. But when no trace surfaced, and search dogs lost his scent less than 200 yards from the truck, the case shifted. Foul play was now on the table. Investigators interviewed friends, classmates, neighbors, anyone who had seen or spoken to Mark in the days leading up to his disappearance. What they found were fragments, puzzles with missing corners. A college friend recalled a strange phone call a week before. Mark had asked vague questions about who had access to the campus labs and how water samples could be traced. It didn't make sense at the time. Another friend, Dana Wells, Mark's girlfriend, told police he'd been on edge for days, nervous, distracted. She'd asked him if something was wrong, and he'd replied, "Not yet, but it might be soon," saying one of the last people to see him outside the family was a gas station clerk named Joe Eldridge. He told police that Mark came in the night before he vanished, bought a map, paid in cash. Looked over his shoulder 3 times. Said almost nothing. Still, there was no solid lead, no named suspect, no obvious motive. But one name did come up more than once: Eli Farnsworth. Eli had been in Mark's environmental science program, quiet, intense, and deeply opinionated. He had a reputation for being fiercely protective of local industries, especially the Creswell chemical plant, which employed his father. Mark had written a senior thesis on water contamination near Fall Creek. Some of his findings, though unpublished, had raised serious questions about Creswell's runoff practices. Rumor had it, Mark was planning to submit his research to a state environmental commission. Eli was questioned briefly, but denied any involvement. Claimed he hadn't spoken to Mark in over a month. No charges were filed. For the Holloways, the days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. No new evidence. No tips. No sightings. Mark's face appeared in newspapers, on local news broadcasts, and pinned to bulletin boards in diners and gas stations. But slowly, and then all at once, the world moved on. Bridge Hollow tried to return to normal, but it never quite did. The town held a candlelight vigil that fall. Dozens gathered at the old church. Laura read a passage from Mark's favorite book. His mother couldn't speak. His father stared at the floor. And then winter came. And with it, silence. In December, the case was formally reclassified as cold. Officially, Mark Holloway was still a missing person. But unofficially, quietly, most believed he was gone for good. Gone, but not forgotten. Especially not by Laura. Over the next few years, she compiled everything she could: timelines, interviews, taped conversations. She kept a detailed journal of every rumor, every name, every theory. She even tried to gain access to the police file, but was denied. At night, she'd lie awake wondering about the cereal box scrap. They're watching the river. What did it mean? Who was they? And what trail ended where the trees stopped? No one in town could explain it. Most didn't want to try. Years passed. She left home. Started over in Pittsburgh. Became a reporter. And still, every year she returned to Fall Creek. Walked the same trails. Stood at the same spot where the truck had been found. Wondered if she'd missed something. She never did. But 20 years later, someone else didn't miss her. In February of 2005, Laura received a letter. No return address. Postmarked from Missouri. Inside, a single sentence. The trail ends where the trees stop whispering. I'm sorry I couldn't come back. Signed, M. And just like that, the case was open again. Time does strange things to grief. In the first few weeks after someone disappears, everything feels urgent. Doors swing open, phones ring late into the night, footsteps echo louder than they should. There's motion searches, interviews, maps with pins, theories scribbled in notebooks. Hope still feels like a reasonable thing. But then, time stretches. Days blur. Leads fade. Hope starts to feel dangerous. By the winter of 1985, the investigation into Mark Holloway's disappearance had entered a quiet, disorienting phase, not closed, not forgotten, just suspended. Cold. Detective Ray Landers still kept a file open on his desk, a small act of defiance. But without new evidence or fresh witnesses, the search for Mark became less a pursuit and more a pattern, circling the same unanswered questions over and over. Bridge Hollow, a town of just under 4,000, had already begun its slow retreat from the case. The flyers had curled at the corners, the reward posters faded, even the gossip had lost its edge. And yet, beneath the silence, something darker was growing. Rumors, theories, and just enough inconsistencies in the original investigation to keep the wound open. The first major theory to take root was the idea that Mark had chosen to disappear, walked away from his life, and never looked back. There were no signs of a struggle, the argument went. No blood, no torn clothing, no broken branches leading into the woods. His truck was parked neatly, the keys left in the ignition. It had all the hallmarks of someone trying to vanish without a trace. Some locals even claimed to have seen him, or someone who looked like him, in the weeks that followed. A mechanic in Harrisburg swore a man matching Mark's description came in looking for work. A waitress in West Virginia said he left her a large tip and a smile. None of these sightings were verified, but they fed the idea that maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to be found. For the Holloways, that theory was unbearable. Janice refused to even say it aloud. Roger called it an insult, and Laura, perhaps the one who knew Mark best, found it laughable. "This was someone who told my mom if he'd be 5 minutes late from class," she once told a journalist. "He wouldn't disappear. He wouldn't do that to us." The second theory was more ominous, that Mark had uncovered something or someone he shouldn't have. The summer before his disappearance, Mark had been studying water samples near Fall Creek for his senior thesis. His project focused on ecological changes in rural waterways. But according to two of his classmates, Mark had begun to suspect something more sinister: chemical pollution, possibly from the nearby Creswell plant. Creswell Chemical had been operating just outside Bridge Hollow for decades. It employed over 200 people and was considered the economic backbone of the town. But there were whispers. Even then, stories of barrels being dumped near the creek, of strange smells wafting through the woods, of dead fish washing up on riverbanks during the hottest months. Mark had allegedly gathered data, unofficial samples, charts, handwritten notes, enough to raise red flags. Some believed he had planned to go public, submit his findings to state officials, maybe even file a report with the Environmental Protection Agency. Then he vanished. A coincidence? Laura never thought so. She remembered weeks before his disappearance hearing him argue with someone on the phone. It was late at night, his voice was sharp, tense. The call ended abruptly, and when she asked who it was, he simply said, "Nobody." But he didn't sleep that night. Another piece of the puzzle came from a former Creswell employee who came forward years later anonymously. He claimed there had been undocumented dumping near Fall Creek, that someone in the plant's management had been warned that a kid from the college was poking around. Nothing ever came of the tip. The man refused to speak on record. And without Mark's notes or his voice, it was just another ghost in a story full of shadows. Then there was the third theory, the one people only whispered about after a few drinks, that Mark had been killed, not by strangers, but by someone he knew. Eli Farnsworth's name came up again and again. Eli had been in the same environmental science program, brilliant but hot-tempered. He defended Creswell vehemently, not just because his father worked there, but because he believed in industry over activism. He thought people like Mark were idealists without solutions. The two had clashed publicly during a senior seminar. Witnesses recalled raised voices, accusations. One professor had to intervene. After graduation, Eli returned to Bridge Hollow and took a job at a logistics firm. Quiet, ordinary. But some believed that whatever grudge he'd carried hadn't ended in the classroom. When questioned in 1985, Eli denied any involvement. He claimed they hadn't spoken in weeks. He had no alibi for the evening Mark disappeared, but without physical evidence there was nothing the police could do. Years later, Laura tracked him down, not as a sister but as a reporter. He refused to speak, closed the door without a word. Then came the anonymous letters. Not the one from 2005 that would arrive much later, but smaller ones earlier. Between 1986 and 1988, Janice Holloway received 3 short, typed notes. No return address, postmarked from different towns. Each message was only a single line. "Stop digging. Let it go." He chose to leave. They were turned over to the police. No fingerprints, no DNA, no follow-up. But Janice kept them in a box under her bed. Next to Mark's graduation photo. Next to the last note he ever left, the one Laura found scrawled on the inside of a cereal box. "They're watching the river. If anything happens, follow the trail to where the trees stop." That sentence became a kind of obsession for Laura. She copied it over and over, studied it like scripture. What did it mean? Was it literal? Was it metaphor? She returned to Fall Creek nearly every summer, walked the trails, looked for anything that felt different or wrong or overlooked. She interviewed retired rangers, local hunters, surveyors. She even hired a private tracker once, a man named Boone Yates, ex-military, with a nose for lost things. He spent 3 days in the preserve. Came back with only one thing to say. There's a trail that doesn't match the official maps. Overgrown, half-buried, it curves east behind the main ridge. Could have been man-made. Someone tried to hide it. But nothing came of it. No new clues. No new evidence. Just more silence. By the mid-1990s, most people assumed Mark Holloway was dead. The police had stopped checking in. The media had moved on. Even the local paper, once so eager to run his story, declined to cover the 10th anniversary. Only Laura kept the story alive. She wrote articles, started a blog, posted scanned versions of Mark's journal entries, asked questions no one wanted to answer. In 1999, she submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to access the original police file. It was denied. Active case. A technicality. In 2003, she filed again. Again denied. But that year, something else happened. She received a phone call. It came from a blocked number. A man's voice. Hoarse. Nervous. He said one sentence. "You're not crazy." He didn't disappear. He was taken. And then he hung up. Laura recorded it, played it over and over, ran the audio through enhancement software. No luck, but it was enough to light the fire again. Then, in 2005, the letter arrived. Not typed, not anonymous in tone, not a threat. It was familiar, almost gentle. The trail ends where the trees stop whispering. "I'm sorry I couldn't come back." And below it, the letter M. Mark? A cruel hoax? Or a key long buried, finally uncovered? Laura didn't know. But for the first time in 20 years, she didn't feel alone. Someone else out there remembered. Someone else still cared. And if it was really him, if Mark had somehow survived, escaped, vanished by choice or by force, then the next step was clear. She had to follow the trail. Even if it led her somewhere, she didn't want to go. It had been almost 20 years to the day when the envelope arrived. It was a gray February morning, the kind where everything feels muted, the light, the air, the heartbeat of a quiet house in a town that had long stopped waiting for answers. Janice Holloway opened the front door, stepped out in her robe to collect the mail, and there it was. A single envelope, slightly yellowed, no return address. Postmarked from Missouri. She turned it over in her hands. It had no markings other than her name, not even Holloway family or resident. Just Janice Holloway, written in neat, careful script. She called Laura immediately. By then, Laura was living in Pittsburgh, working as a journalist for a small investigative news outlet. She was used to fielding odd phone calls, tips, rumors, sometimes even threats, but this was different. When she heard her mother's voice trembling on the other end, she dropped everything and drove the 3 hours home. They opened the envelope together at the old oak dining table where Mark used to sit with his textbooks spread out in front of him. Inside was a single piece of lined paper, folded twice. The handwriting was shaky, slanted, almost childlike, but immediately Laura felt something twist in her chest. It was familiar, painfully familiar. The note read, "The trail ends where the trees stop whispering. I'm sorry I couldn't come back. M." There was no date, no address, no explanation, just that. Folded inside the same envelope was a hand-drawn map. It wasn't crude, it was deliberate. Someone had taken time to draw every curve of the Fall Creek Trail, including details that only someone intimately familiar with it would know. The 2 bent trees that arched over the river bend, the old ranger's shed marked with an X, even the location where Mark's truck had once been found. But there was something else on the map. Something no one had seen before. An offshoot. A narrow path diverging from the main trail, curving into the eastern ridge, ending near a cluster of lines labeled The Hollow. There was no such trail on any official map. Laura had walked those woods every summer since Mark disappeared. She thought she knew them better than anyone. But this was new. Or hidden. Or both. She stared at the page in silence for a long time. Then she whispered, "It's him." Janice didn't answer. She was holding the note in both hands, the paper trembling slightly. She said, "It's his R. Look at the way he writes the R." Laura already knew. She didn't need handwriting analysis to feel the truth of it in her bones. But truth and proof were two different things. The next day, Laura drove the letter and map to a document analysis expert in Pittsburgh, someone she'd worked with before on a corruption case involving forged medical records. His name was Dr. Nathan Voss, a retired FBI forensic linguist. He examined the letter under magnification, then under UV light. He ran ink density tests, pen pressure measurements, and stroke consistency comparisons against samples of Mark's old journals and school essays. The results weren't conclusive. Not enough overlapping letters. Too much degradation. But Voss circled three things. First, the capital M. It was uniquely sloped with a shallow middle peak, a match for Mark's known signature. Second, the phrase itself, "Where the trees stop whispering." It had appeared before. Once, in a letter Mark had written to Laura during her freshman year of high school. He was studying forest acoustics and had written, "I swear sometimes the trees whisper when the wind hits just right. Maybe when they stop, they're hiding something." Third, the paper. Ordinary, ruled notebook paper. But in the margins, barely visible, were three impressions made by heavy pen pressure, like the writer had used the page over a softer surface. Voss enhanced the indentations. Two looked like random scribbles, but the third was a number. 39.0741到92.1718. GPS coordinates. Laura typed them into her laptop. They pointed to a wooded area outside Columbia, Missouri, a nature reserve just east of the city. No house, no mailbox, just trees. She sat back in her chair, pulse pounding. What was Mark doing in Missouri? If this was even Mark at all. Theories began to spiral. Had he been living off the grid for 2 decades? Was he being held? Was he watching? Or had someone cruel, someone calculated, staged this entire letter as a hoax? Laura brought the findings to the local police. Detective Ray Landers had long since retired, but he agreed to meet with her for coffee. He listened to her story, read the letter, studied the map. Then he said, "If this is real, it's the first new lead in 20 years." He paused. "But it's also a very good way to get you chasing ghosts again." Laura didn't care. She packed her bag the next morning and boarded a flight to Missouri. When she arrived, she rented a car and drove straight to the coordinates. It led her to Hinkson Creek Conservation Area, 70 acres of dense forest, shallow ravines, and winding trails. There were no cabins, no rangers, just dirt and trees and silence. She walked for hours. She didn't know what she was looking for, until she found the barn. It wasn't much a slanted roof, partially collapsed, hidden behind a wall of overgrown brush. No paths leading to it, no signage, just a forgotten structure sinking into the earth. Inside, the air was stale and damp. Rusted tools lay scattered in the corner. A collapsed cot rested beneath a broken window. And, beneath the floorboards loose, warped Laura found a metal tin. Inside, a single Polaroid photo of Fall Creek, dated August 1985. A ripped journal page with soil analysis scribbled across the front. And a small leather keychain, the same one Mark used to carry in high school, shaped like a trout. She sat on the floor, unable to breathe. It was him. He had been here. She took everything and returned home. The photo was authenticated. The journal page matched Mark's writing. DNA pulled from the keychain was tested partial profile only, degraded by age but consistent with the Holloway family. Still, no body. No confession. Just evidence of presence. A trace. A ghost. News of the letter broke quickly. Local papers picked it up, then regional outlets, then a segment on America's Missing ran a profile including the map, the letter, and an interview with Laura. Tips flooded in. Most were dead ends. People claiming to have seen Mark. People insisting he was living under another name in Colorado. One woman in Alabama swore she had taught his child in 2nd grade. But one tip stood out. A man who said he worked at a supply store in Columbia in 1993 remembered someone coming in asking for topographic maps of Pennsylvania. Said the man was quiet, wore a cap pulled low, bought a compass, 2 water canteens, and left. When shown a picture of Mark, he hesitated, then said, "That could have been him." I'm in. It wasn't enough to confirm anything, but it was enough to keep going, enough to prove that the trail cold for 2 decades had never truly ended. It had just gone underground. Laura returned to Bridge Hollow that spring. She stood at the entrance to Fall Creek Preserve, the hand-drawn map in one hand and a new one, topographic, modern in the other. She followed the path to the point where the main trail curved left, just like the drawing, and there, behind a fallen log and a wall of tangled brush, she found it. A narrow, nearly invisible trail. Overgrown, forgotten, but real. She stepped onto it, and the trees, once so loud with the wind, suddenly felt still, as if they were holding their breath. The letter had already changed everything, but for Laura Holloway it wasn't enough. Not yet. She had a map, a phrase, and a broken timeline that had stretched and twisted for 20 years, and still no answer to the only question that mattered. Was her brother alive? In the weeks after returning from Missouri, she didn't sleep much. She kept the letter on her nightstand, studied it in the quietest hours, searching for something, anything she might have missed. And then she found it. It started with the way the paper folded. Something about the creases felt intentional. Not just folded in half or thirds, but at a diagonal, as if someone had lined up edges on purpose. She remembered how her brother used to fold notes like that in high school like puzzles, with secret corners and tucked flaps. She unfolded the letter again, this time holding it under a lamp, and that's when she saw them. Tiny impressions. Not ink, not pencil. Just faint grooves pressed into the fibers of the paper, only visible from certain angles. Like someone had written on top of the letter while it was folded, and the pressure had left its mark. She held her breath, and then picked up the phone. Her call went to Julian Sorrell, an old college friend, now a data journalist in Philadelphia. Julian was obsessive, sharp, and had helped Laura once before when she was chasing inconsistencies in a medical corruption case. He agreed to meet the next morning. They laid the letter flat under a cold LED light on his kitchen table. He scanned it, enhanced it digitally, and ran texture contrast filters through a forensic imaging software used in bank fraud investigations. The results were clearer than either of them expected. There were 3 distinct pen impressions, shallow but deliberate. 2 looked like numbers. 1 looked like a symbol. The first string read, CR11 48之N. The second, FC3MD. The third, a set of concentric circles, like ripples in water, drawn with a slow, careful hand. Julian leaned back. Coordinates, he said? Or markers? Laura stared at the screen. What does FC mean? Fall Creek, Julian offered. 3 meters down? She shook her head. Mark never used metric. But then she remembered something. During his senior thesis, Mark had joked about using metric just to irritate one of his professors, a man who insisted Americans never needed it. She pulled up scans of his old field journals. There it was. 3M depth. Anomaly. Same phrase. Same shorthand. Same handwriting. Julian noticed it too. He ran a side-by-side comparison of the newly uncovered impressions against entries from Mark's journals in 1984. The pen pressure matched. So did the curvature of the lowercase a's and the downward stroke of the lowercase g's. It wasn't just a match. It was his. Laura sat in silence. It had been 20 years, but somehow Mark had written this letter, or someone had gone to terrifying lengths to make it look like he did, which raised a new question, one more disturbing than any she'd asked so far. Was Mark still alive? Or had someone found his writings and used them? Julian leaned forward. Laura, he said carefully, what if this is all staged? The thought had crossed her mind more than once. What if the letter, the map, the Missouri barn, even the tin box, had all been part of an elaborate deception, something designed to draw her in, feed her hope, keep her digging? But why? What was the end game? That night, Laura drove home and stared at the letter again. Not as a sister, but as a reporter. She started cataloging everything: timestamps, pen pressure, fold lines, ink saturation, map grid alignments. She sent the envelope to a private forensics lab in Maryland. No fingerprints, no usable DNA. But under microscopic analysis, they discovered something strange: tiny traces of iron oxide embedded in the edges of the paper. Rust, which meant the letter had likely been stored near something metal for a long time. A barn? A box? Or somewhere worse? A week later, Laura received a package. New return address. New note. Just a manila envelope sealed with tape. Inside was a cassette tape. No label, no markings. Just 60 minutes of magnetic tape, coiled and waiting. She stared at it for nearly an hour before she played it. She didn't use her laptop. She didn't digitize it. She went to the attic, found the old Sony Walkman Mark had given her on her 14th birthday, and held it like a relic from another life. She pressed play. The first thing she heard was wind. Then, forest sounds: birds, leaves rustling, distant water trickling over rocks. It went on for nearly 7 minutes. Then a voice. Soft, breathy, like someone was speaking into cloth. At first, she couldn't make out the words. Then, faintly, I saw the fire. I saw the fire. Silence. Then static. Then the same voice again. This time a whisper so low she had to press the headphones hard against her ears. Don't trust them. They knew. They knew in '85. Then a click. A long pause. And finally, one last phrase, barely above a whisper. The river isn't clean. The tape ended in white noise. Laura sat frozen, her fingers trembling against the plastic player. She played it again, and again. Every sound became a clue. The way the wind moved, the texture of the voice, the strange distortion behind the final whisper, like a second voice trying to speak beneath the first. She brought the tape to an audio specialist. He cleaned the background, ran voice signature tests, compared the recordings to old home videos of Mark from high school. Preliminary result: 85% match. Not enough for certainty, but enough for belief. Laura began compiling the evidence: the letter, the map, the tin box from Missouri, the impressions on the page, the cassette tape. One piece at a time, she assembled what she called the echo file. She brought it to the police. They took it seriously this time. The lead investigator assigned to the reopened case was Detective Alicia Prentice, young, analytical, and far more open to unconventional angles than the officers who'd first handled the case in 1985. She reviewed the materials, brought in state forensics, reopened witness interviews, and scheduled a second search of Fall Creek. This time they had something new: coordinates, depth, a possible burial site. The team, led by a geospatial analyst, began a targeted ground-penetrating radar sweep near the East Ridge, exactly where the offshoot trail from the letter's map had led. On the third day, they found a cavity underground about 3 meters down. It was empty. No body, no clothing, no bones, but embedded in the soil were traces of charred wood, and beneath that a rusted hinge, the kind used on an industrial barrel. And lodged beside it, buried under layers of clay, was a small metal tag, stamped with 5 numbers: Cry, 11 to 85. The same sequence found in the pen impression from the letter. Laura stared at it in the sunlight. Her brother had known. He had tried to expose it. And someone had buried the truth. Literally. Theories surged once again. Was Mark silenced in 1985 for what he discovered? Had he tried to come forward and failed? Was the cassette tape a warning or a goodbye? And if someone was now sending these messages, why? Who were they? What were they trying to tell her? Laura published a story. Not in a major outlet. Not on national television. She chose something quieter. A blog post titled, "The River Isn't Clean. A Personal Investigation into My Brother's Disappearance." She laid it all out: the letter, the tape, the off-the-record tips, the Creswell plant's history, the inconsistencies in the original police reports, and the real possibility that Mark Holloway had uncovered something worth dying for. Within days, the story spread. Within weeks, former Creswell employees started speaking out. Anonymous tips, signed affidavits, old maps showing dumping zones, and with them the rising suspicion that Mark had been telling the truth all along. But the question remained, was this all just evidence left behind? Or was someone still out there? Watching, guiding, whispering from the shadows of the past. As Laura prepared to return to Fall Creek one final time, she listened to the cassette again. She played the last few seconds on repeat. The voice, quiet and full of weight, said, "The river isn't clean." Then static. Then something else. A breath? A second voice? Or an echo? She didn't know yet. But she was going to find out. The forest sounds on the cassette tape had haunted Laura Holloway for weeks. Not just because they echoed the trail she'd walked as a teenager, searching for a brother who never came home. Not just because the wind and birdsong were unmistakably from Fall Creek. But because beneath them, underneath the hiss of tape and the rustle of leaves, was a voice. Whispered. Broken. "I saw the fire." Those 4 words changed everything. Detective Alicia Prentice played the tape 6 times in the precinct's evidence room. Then she played it for a forensic audio team from Harrisburg. They filtered out background noise, stabilized the recording, and found something Elsian anomaly in the left audio channel. A brief click, followed by the sound of something metallic scraping wood. It matched a latch, possibly a tin box, possibly something buried. That was enough. 1 month after the tape arrived, the investigation returned to where it all began. The Fall Creek Preserve. But this time, they weren't looking with flashlights and search dogs. This time, they came with scanners, drones, GPR units, and coordinates triangulated from the pen impressions hidden in the letter. Laura stood at the trailhead in the early morning light, gripping the hand-drawn map in one hand and her brother's notebook in the other. The trees seemed taller than she remembered, older and quieter, as if they too were waiting. She wasn't alone. A state forensics team moved methodically through the East Ridge area just beyond the curve in the offshoot trail that had gone undiscovered for years. It was steep and difficult terrain, grown over with mountain laurel and dense brush, the kind of place no one would stumble across accidentally. But on the 3rd day, at the base of a crumbling stone outcrop, the scanner lit up. Metal, small, shallow, just under a foot of soil. They dug carefully, slowly. And then they found it. A tin box, rust-ringed, heavy, sealed with a single strip of deteriorated duct tape. The lid was dented but intact. One side bore faint burn marks, as if it had been exposed to fire or buried in ash. The box was opened on site, photographed, catalogued. Inside, 5 items. A roll of 35mm film negatives, partially melted. 2 torn journal pages, written in the same looping script as the 2005 letter. A small, scorched scrap of clothered and black plaid, singed at the edges. And a receipt. Folded, stained, and barely legible, the receipt was from a supply store in Columbia, Missouri. Dated August 1985. Name, M. Holloway. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was fire. Literal, figurative. And it cracked open something the town of Bridge Hollow had tried to keep sealed for 20 years. The first journal page, when digitally restored, contained a half-finished entry. They keep rerouting the barrels. Told me I had no clearance, but I saw them. Near the old Ranger Road. It's not runoff. It's dumping. And Creswell knows. Creswell. The word appeared twice on the page, underlined both times. The second page was torn more severely. Only a few words were legible. Fire last night, not natural. I saw... The rest was gone. The film negatives were rushed to a recovery lab in Washington, D.C. It took weeks, but 3 frames were eventually salvaged. One showed a photo of the Fall Creek riverbed, taken from a high ridge. There were barrels in the image half submerged, labeled in faded stenciling. Another showed what appeared to be a field notebook, open to a page with chemical notations. The last was a blurry shot of someone walking near a burn pit, face obscured, wearing what looked like a Creswell security jacket. The investigation took a sharp turn. Laura stood in the evidence room and stared at the photographs through thick glass. Even after all these years, it felt like her brother was still talking to her, still leaving clues, still trying to finish a story no one had let him tell. She pressed her palm against the glass and whispered, "You saw the fire. Now we do too." Detective Prentice reopened the Environmental Report archives from the 1980s. What she found was alarming. In July 1985, 2 weeks before Mark disappeared, Creswell Chemical had been anonymously reported for unregistered chemical disposal near the eastern edge of Fall Creek. The file showed that an investigator had been assigned, but the inspection was canceled. No follow-up, no documentation, just a single note, resolved internally. The name listed under the resolution? Sheriff Dalton Ray. He was the lead law enforcement officer in 1985, the man who had first dismissed Mark's disappearance as voluntary, now retired. Living just outside Bridge Hollow, Prentice paid him a visit. He denied everything, claimed he had no memory of the complaint, said he barely remembered Mark Holloway. Just another runaway, he shrugged. Tragic, but not uncommon. When she showed him the recovered journal pages, his expression didn't change. But Laura noticed something in his eyes. Not confusion. Recognition. That night, someone broke into the evidence storage facility. Nothing was stolen, but the tin box was opened. The burned cloth was missing. Security footage showed nothing. No alarms triggered. No signs of forced entry. Someone had a key. Prentice tightened security, moved all materials off-site, and Laura doubled down. She published a second exposé. This one included the photo of the barrel-strewn riverbed, a side-by-side comparison of Mark's handwriting, and a timeline linking Creswell's unexplained fire in the summer of '85 to the day Mark was last seen. The story went viral. Environmental activists picked it up. Podcasts dissected it. A documentary crew from New York reached out. But Laura declined every interview. This wasn't entertainment. This was her brother. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection reopened its investigation into Creswell's practices. So did the EPA. And that's when the whistleblowers came forward. 3 former employees. Each gave sworn statements. Each said the same thing. In 1985, Creswell had been illegally dumping toxic solvents into tributaries near Fall Creek. Mark Holloway had asked questions first politely, then persistently. He'd even approached one of the site managers with evidence. Days later, he vanished. The whistleblowers didn't know what happened to him, but they believed he'd found something no one wanted uncovered. And now, 20 years later, the echoes of that secret were rising again. 1 week after the statements were made public, a new envelope arrived at Laura's office. No return address. Inside, 1 sentence. He never made it to the ridge. There was no signature. No date. Just that. Laura took it to Prentice. The ink matched the same pen used in the original 2005 letter. But the phrasing was different. Shorter, more urgent. As if whoever had written it was running out of time. Or hiding. Detective Prentice authorized one final search this time with excavation permits and forensic archaeologists. They focused on a stretch of woods just south of the ridge, where the journal entry had mentioned barrels and where the new letter implied Mark had been stopped. On day 4, a cadaver dog gave a hit. They dug. 3 feet down, they uncovered more charred wood remnants of a campfire, a melted flashlight, and a piece of bone. Small. Human. Testing began immediately. Laura didn't wait for the results. She went back to Fall Creek, back to the trail, back to the place where the trees no longer whispered, where the silence had always felt like warning. She walked alone, just as she had 20 years ago. But this time, she wasn't a girl searching for her brother. She was a woman chasing the truth. And now, for the first time, the truth was beginning to answer. Sometimes, it's not the fire that does the most damage. It's the ash it leaves behind, heavy, choking, quietly settling over everything until the truth is buried under layers of silence and time. By the spring of 2005, the ash around Fall Creek had started to lift, slowly, reluctantly. And with it came the truth piece by piece, page by page, file by file. Laura Holloway had spent 2 decades chasing ghosts. Now she was chasing records. Old ones, fragile ones, some tucked away in forgotten file cabinets at county offices. Others buried deeper, behind redacted reports and bureaucratic silence. But what she found confirmed what she had feared all along. Mark hadn't just disappeared. He had been silenced. The first clue came from a municipal archive in Harrisburg, a stack of photocopied compliance records from 1985, unearthed by a DEP auditor named Denise Ward. Laura had connected with Denise after publishing her expose on Creswell Chemical. It turned out Denise had grown up just 2 towns over. She remembered the stories, the whispers. She offered to help. What they found was stunning. Between April and July of 1985, the exact window when Mark was conducting his independent study on watershed pollution Creswell Chemical, had failed 3 consecutive inspections. Each one documented abnormalities in soil pH levels and elevated trace metals downstream from the plant. Each one recommended follow-up action. None were acted on. Why? Because each report had been stamped, "Resolved, see internal memo." But the memos were missing. All of them. Gone. Except for one line at the bottom of an interagency fax. Spoke with local enforcement. Situation under control. Will not escalate further. Dr. Dr. Dalton Ray. The same sheriff who had first labeled Mark Holloway's disappearance as a probable runaway. The same man who in 2005 claimed to barely remember the case. The cover-up had a name. And now it had a paper trail. Laura took the documents to Detective Prentice, who began building a dossier of her own. It wasn't enough for an indictment, not yet, but it was enough for a full internal investigation, enough to bring the case to the state attorney's office. And then the breakthrough came. An anonymous email sent from a burner account. No greeting, no signature, just one sentence and an attachment. He wasn't quiet about what he found. He told the wrong person. The attachment was a scanned page from a Creswell employee logbook dated June 1985. It recorded an internal incident report. 7:14 p.m. Subject Holloway. Unauthorized. Confronted E. Moss at Site 3. Escorted from premises. Spoke with Supervisor Hendricks. No further contact expected. Laura froze. Holloway. Site 3. Escorted. Supervisor Hendricks had been the plant's senior environmental officer at the time, a man with no public profile, no interviews, and no known statements on record. According to company files, he had resigned in September 1985, just 2 months after Mark vanished. No reason given. He disappeared from the paper trail entirely. Laura tried to find him. No address. No phone number. Not even a digital footprint. Dead end. Until she received a voicemail. Blocked number. A man's voice, older, raspy. He didn't say his name. Didn't say where he was calling from. Just this. He came to me with data. Showed me samples. Said he'd seen the barrels going into the woods. Said he had photos. I told him to be careful. That was the last time I saw him. I still see his face. Then the line went dead. Laura recorded the message, backed it up in 3 places, and gave a copy to Prentice. The voice was run through vocal forensics. Match probability, 83%. To whom? Eldon Moss. The same employee Mark had reportedly confronted at Site 3. A man long rumored to be part of Creswell's Clean Team, the group responsible for erasing mistakes before regulators arrived. Laura couldn't confirm it, but now she had a trail. And she followed it. Moss had retired in 1991. He had no family, no criminal record, but he had been deposed in a civil case involving chemical exposure in 1988, and in that deposition he was asked whether Creswell had ever engaged in illegal dumping. He had answered, under oath, "Not to my knowledge." Auber. Laura found the transcript. And she found the timestamp. The date? The 5th of October, 1988. Exactly 3 years after Mark's disappearance. The more she dug, the more clear it became. Mark had been gathering evidence, soil samples, photos, notes, a map. He had intended to go public, and someone, or some network, had made sure he didn't. The evidence was mounting, but there was still no body. No crime scene. No smoking gun. The investigation hovered in a liminal space, too many questions to ignore, too few answers to prosecute. And yet, the closer Laura got to the truth, the more dangerous the silence became. One night she returned to her car after a late interview with a former Creswell janitor. The back window was cracked. Nothing stolen. Just a small stone on the driver's seat, wrapped in paper. On it, a single line: "Don't dig up the past if you can't bury it again." Laura turned it in. Prentice logged it. No prints, no witnesses. But the message was clear. And Laura? She didn't care. If anything, it made her dig harder. She started piecing together timelines, connecting the dots between the dump site discovered near Fall Creek and the Creswell delivery logs from 1985. She found discrepancies: entire shipments of solvents logged as in transit that never arrived at any destination. Ghost deliveries, phantom barrels. She compiled them into a report, the Holloway Files. Nearly 200 pages of analysis, data, transcripts, and interviews. She submitted them to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office. She submitted them to the EPA, and she posted them online in full. Within a week, her site had over 400,000 views. Within 2, she was getting calls from national reporters. And still, she refused interviews. "This isn't about a headline," she said. "This is about a name. Mark Holloway. Her brother. The boy who told her the trees out west could sing. The young man who had walked into the forest not to disappear but to tell the truth." Laura visited Fall Creek again that June. She stood at the edge of the ridge, map in hand, and looked down at the clearing where the tin box had been found. This time the birds were louder, the wind gentler, and for the first time in 2 decades she didn't feel alone. When she turned to leave, she found something wedged between 2 roots. It was small, smooth, a river stone. Painted on it in faded blue ink was a single letter: M. No one saw who left it. No footprints. No witnesses. Just the stone, waiting. Laura picked it up and held it tight. She didn't know if her brother was still alive, but she knew this: he had spoken. Through ash, through maps, through whispers in the trees. And now the silence was cracking. The envelope arrived in spring, the 12th of March, 2024. A cloudy morning, the air still holding on to winter's chill. Laura Holloway found it in her mailbox, wedged between bills and an overstuffed flyer from a local grocery chain. She recognized it instantly. No return address. No stamp. Just her name handwritten in that same slanted script. Careful, familiar. And suddenly it was 2005 again. Suddenly she was sitting at the dining room table with her mother, unfolding a note that had opened a door they thought had been sealed forever. This time Laura opened it alone. Inside, 1 line: "Tell them I tried." No signature. No map. No cassette. Just those 4 words, written in fading black ink, like a whisper committed to paper. Laura read it again. "Tell them I tried." She held the paper to her chest and closed her eyes. 19 years had passed since the first letter. 39 since her brother disappeared. She wasn't sure which moment felt heavier, but this one felt final. She took it to Detective Alicia Prentice, who was now one of the longest-serving officers in the county and one of the most respected. Prentice ordered a full forensic workup: ink analysis, fiber trace, DNA lift attempts. And she submitted one final test, the kind that hadn't existed when the case first broke open nearly 2 decades earlier. Touch DNA from the film negatives recovered in 2005. Technology had advanced. Degradation could be repaired, fragmented markers reassembled, and this time they got a match. Partial but décisif. Mark Holloway had handled the film. The confirmation was clinical, scientific, and devastating, because it meant he had survived long enough to develop the evidence, long enough to hide it, long enough to mail it, long enough to try. But still, No body was found. No bones. No confirmed sightings. No arrest. Only echoes. In the months that followed, Laura quietly stepped away from the spotlight. She declined interviews, turned down a documentary deal, and stopped publishing articles. The site she had maintained the Holloway files remained online, but she stopped updating it. Some thought she had finally found peace. Others thought she had given up. But neither were true. She was just listening, because she had come to believe that Mark's story wasn't one that ended. It was one that lingered in tree bark, in river water, in scorched soil and handwritten maps. In March, Laura visited Fall Creek one last time. Not with search teams or camera crews or detectives. Alone. She walked the old trail slowly, one foot in front of the other, the wind pushing softly against her shoulders. The trees overhead swayed with the same rhythm they always had, but now they no longer felt like barriers. They felt like memory. She passed the old ranger shed, long since collapsed, past the overlook where Mark's photo had once captured barrels rising from the river, and then she came to the fork, the one from the hand-drawn map. The one she hadn't known existed until her brother's letter arrived in 2005. To the left, the public trail wide, well-worn. To the right, a narrow break in the underbrush, leading to the hollow. She paused. The forest was still. Somewhere far off, a bird called once, then fell silent. Laura stepped onto the hidden path, the same way she had nearly 20 years earlier when she first followed the map. The ground was soft with spring thaw. Mud clung to her boots. She ducked beneath a low-hanging branch, brushed her hand along the moss-covered trunk of a tree that looked far older than it had any right to be. And then she stopped. Not because she saw anything, but because she felt something. A weight in the air. A presence. Not fear, never fear. Not here. She looked around, slowly, and then turned, as if someone had whispered her name. No one was there. Only the trees. Only the trail. Only the wind. She stood there for a long time, and then she smiled, not because she had found what she was looking for, but because maybe, just maybe, it had found her. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that had always been the point. The camera would hold there if this were a film on her silhouette in the woods, framed by branches, motionless as the forest breathed around her. The light would shift. The wind would rise. And in that final moment, as the screen fades to black, a voice would speak. Some stories don't end. They echo,